Kawaguchi, take one. We're talking about the Depression and the coming of the war. I'd like to start early in the period and get both of your sense of what it was like growing up in San Francisco in the early 30s. Mrs. Kawaguchi, first, you tell me what it was like being in a hotel in Chinatown as a little girl.
It was a hard time, but we didn't know any differently because so many of our friends lived the same way. We wore hand-me-downs from my biggest sister down to my sister below me. And we ate a lot of rice with a little bit of meat, a lot of vegetables. We went to school with books, laid them down, walking miles, it seemed like miles, to school where we met so many of our other Japanese American friends, as well as I did have some good Caucasian friends too. But outside of that, we had a fairly happy childhood.
In other words, you can be poor but happy.
Right.
Tell me, your family grew up actually closer to the Japanese community.
Well, not actually. We first started out living in a Jewish community. In fact, there were a lot of German Jews and Russian Jews. And in fact, I first learned how to swear in Yiddish. And practically all of my friends were Caucasian at that time, until I started grammar school. And then for the first time, I met my first Japanese American. And school, fortunately, was only about 4 or 5 blocks from the house. And so invariably, I'd stop by and see some of my friends as I go to school.
What was the Japanese community like then?
At that time, well, Japantown was, about 6 or 7 blocks away, and we hardly went there, maybe once a month for grocery shopping or whatever.
But was it a little self-contained world?
It was really very much...
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
It was very much it was about 4 blocks east and west, and about 4 blocks north and south, which contained majority of the Japanese stores and hotels, businesses, and residents. And we moved into Japantown in 1935, and I also started delivering Japanese paper about that time, and I was delivering it in Japantown. And at that time, I think I was delivering something like 150 papers.
Did you have a sense of how San Francisco was doing in general? Would you see problems in other parts of the city?
Well, most of my friends were, their parents were working for either another Japanese or doing domestic work, primarily because jobs were scarce and very hard to get. And somehow or other, well, we were relatively poor, and our friends were about in the same boat. And but we didn't give it a second thought. We had our community activities. We had our Boy Scout troops, the YMCA. So we had a pretty good program going as far as the community was concerned. Also, our parents had their clubs and organizations, which had picnics annually or some sort of gathering. And even the YMCA and YWCA would put on shows.
When you were a kid during that period, did you have to go to the Japanese language schools, and what did you think of doing that?
That's been a very sensitive subject with my parents.
I mean, that was an important part of
Right. Well, my father, he went to high school in San Francisco, and so he spoke English. And whereas my mother was too busy raising 7 kids, and so she spoke broken English. But then, at the same time, when we conversed with her, it was primarily Japanese. And one day they decided that I should go to Japanese school. I fought against it, but I lost and I went. But I didn't last very long because
hang on a second, we've got to play. We've got to cut.
Take 2.
3 minutes.
Okay, so start off with when your parents decided you had to.
my mother and father decided that I should go to Japanese school. And I fought against it and lost. So I went to Japanese school. And it was kind of embarrassing because here I was already about 13, 14 years old, and here I'm competing against 8 and 9-year-old kids. And I was starting from scratch. And I studied, but I just didn't like it at all. And I lasted exactly 6 months, and I finally quit. And in fact, I was sort of goofing off by going there. All I did was play football or basketball with the kids. And when we went to school, their system was so archaic. I tell you, it was terrible. We'd stand in front of the teacher and be reading aloud whatever the Japanese characters were and so forth. And sometimes I didn't even know what the character was, but I just kept mumbling along and got away with it, I thought, until the teacher says, "What?" And then says, "Kawaguchi-san, would you repeat that again, you know?" And I said, "I don't know what this is." So one day I got a visit, my parents got a visit from the teacher, says, "Your son hasn't been to school." And my parents finally relented about my not going because they saw I was fighting against it. But I regretted it later, believe me.
Let's go for a second. How are you in this story? Kawaguchi, take 3. Okay, let's shift gears and move on a couple of years in the decade and move on to Treasure Island. Mrs. Kawaguchi, maybe tell us how it was that you came to get the job at the island and what you did there.
Well, I didn't go to work.
Could you turn a little bit more so you face me?
I didn't go to work until 1940. The fair itself had.
Okay.
Could you start again?
Okay, let's start all again. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Well, the fair didn't the fair opened in 1939, and I didn't go to work until 1940. And I think I also only went to work because the bulk of the ladies that worked there in 39 were busy going to school. They all were going to Cal Berkeley, but I didn't. I was going to a business school, and I was free during summer. So I went to work there. It was a good time in my life. I enjoyed it. It was a beautiful place to go to work. But you could tell that things were going to change. One by one, the big pavilions that was open from Europe closed. The French, I don't think the English had a different pavilion, but the Swedish, the European pavilions closed because of the war. And so I think it was only a handful of Asian pavilions open, Chinese, Japanese, and I don't know if any of the Southeast Asian pavilions were open at that time. But it was a wonderful time of my life. It was pretty. Now with the theme parks like Disneyland, I guess you can't compare it like it was when we went to up to Vancouver a few years ago. What else do I remember
But,
about
but
the
you
fair?
hadn't seen theme parks then. You hadn't seen anything like this before.
No, but I'm trying to think of
Yeah.
the way it looks
You
like
know,
now.
when we were talking before, you said something that really summed it up. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you said it before. You said that being at Treasure Island was the last beautiful moment that you remember.
And it's true.
Could you say that again for me?
Well, when I think of Treasure Island, I think that it was the last perfect time of my life because it was something I had never seen before. Very international, saw things from the other countries. But Japan Pavilion, where I worked, was also very, what's the right word? I guess it showed me the kind of things Japan had that I hadn't seen. They had beautiful pearl necklaces, silk materials, obies, lacquer boxes, porcelain cups, saucers.
So this was important because it was learning about your own culture.
Yes.
Mr. Kawaguchi, you spent some time over there. You performed and you visited. Tell me what you remember there.
Well, it was like going to a fairyland. It was kind of a make-believe feeling. And I think the nearest thing to that today probably would be Disneyland or Epcot Center. And we used to go there almost every other week. I was playing in a drum bugle corps, and I was also playing in a band. And so we'd go over and march in a parade and so forth, because they used to have a parade almost every other week. And but what I really enjoyed watching was the 30th Infantry during their retreat program. They had these beautiful colors, the American flag, and the infantry would be one company, would line up below it, and they would do the manual of arms, which was letter perfect. I've never seen it done that perfect before. And the band itself was probably about a 100-piece band, and it had a bugle corps right behind it. And I was just fascinated. Every time I'd go there, I made sure I got there in time for the retreat.
Tell me a little bit about the rest of the fair, about the exhibits and the gateway, and what was all that like?
Well, I tell you, the one pavilion that we kind of enjoyed was the French pavilion, and we enjoyed going there to eat lunch, and especially the waitresses. They wore these real petite outfits, and the fellas all used to enjoy that. But in the gateway, of all things, if I'd be there with my business suit on, I'd be walking up the gateway and happen to pass Sally Rand's Newton Ranch. The barker there would try to drag me in, and but when I'm in my band uniform or Boy Scout uniform, he says, "Go away, son, go away." So, it's kind of a... But the gateway was really a fun place for the different kinds of games that they had there and rides.
Were you attracted to the Japanese pavilion at all? Did you want?
Oh yes, we used to go there all the
Did
time.
you say we used to go to the Japanese pavilion? Because we don't know what the area is. Start over and just say we used to.
Yeah, we used to go to the Japanese pavilion, and generally we run into our friends. And at the same time, they had a tempura bar there, and when you eat a tempura bar there, it was really hot. I mean, he was cooking it right in front of you so that you could eat it. And unfortunately, at that time I was working, so I could afford to go ahead and do that.
Do you have any of the same sense from the period that Sadako had, that underneath this wonderful surface there was some tension, or were you thinking about those other things?
Yes. Well, I felt that because since I was working for a jet...
What did you feel? I felt tension.
I felt the tension and some anxiety because I was working for an import-export company, Japanese import-export, and at that time, already many of the products was being embargoed, and the Treasury Department was there to make sure that only certain things were on the bills of ladings and so forth. And so the tensions were there. And somehow or other, I felt that it was going to come to something much, much larger than what I expected, of course.
Well, that brings up an interesting question, because a lot of people who were worried in 1939 and 40 were worried about Europe. Were you, when you felt the tension, were you thinking there might be a war with Japan, or were you thinking that the European war was going to engulf us?
Well, I didn't think Japan would be foolish enough to attack the United States. That's one thing, because I knew its capabilities. And, well, you know, Japan was just the size of California, and they didn't have the resources. But yet we were selling them scrap iron, aviation gas, crude oil, and somehow or other, I kind of felt that someday they're going to throw this thing back at us. And so I had made plans to quit my job and go back to school. But then, of course, Pearl Harbor happened.
Let's move over to you, Mrs. Kawaguchi. You were telling me that you didn't believe the war would ever come with Japan either.
Right. Probably it was maybe because we felt that it shouldn't happen, so we just felt that it wouldn't happen. We were all politically very naive. We only knew what we read in the papers. They didn't have television then, so that television really gives out a lot of information. That
you were telling me that you remember talking with one of your friends who thought differently, who thought
he was a far deeper.
Start all over again. Tell me.
Our friend was a far deep thinker than the rest of us. We would be sitting around when we were going to school and talking about dances and what we were going to do when we got out of school. And to him, we were talking very frivolously. And he said, "You mark my words, we're going to go to war." And we said, "Well, we're already at war." This was back in 1939. He said, "Well, I'm not talking about war in Europe." He said, "It's going to be with Japan." And we all hooted, just laughed it off like we knew better than him. But it ended up that he probably knew a little more what might happen than the rest of us.
Let's cut from it. How are we on this?
Mark Kawaguchi, take 4.
The last question I have, I don't know if either one of you has any thoughts on this, and I'm still talking about the pre-war period, before Pearl Harbor. Were you, for example, Mr. Kawaguchi, were you aware growing up here of any sort of ongoing anti-Japanese sentiment? Did you notice that or feel it?
Yes, I first noticed it when I was in the Boy Scouts. We had gone to a swimming pool, and they wouldn't allow the Japanese Americans in the swimming pool. Were forbidden, and that was it. And also barbershops. I was wondering why my father always cut my hair, and then I found out why. The barbershops wouldn't cut any Japanese hairs. And that is until I moved to Japantown. Then, of course, we had our Japanese barbers. And that was the first time I got a professional haircut. And so I did notice these things. And generally, during my high school time, when I go to high school, I'll have my Caucasian friends and so forth. But when I come home, it's all my Japanese friends. And so the activities that I got involved in were primarily a Boy Scout troop that was consisting wholly of Japanese Americans. And in fact, last year they celebrated their 75th anniversary, and they've been invited by Washington, D.C. for the 4th of July Independence Parade.
How about you, Mrs. Kawaguchi? Growing up in San Francisco, were you aware of any problems directed towards Japanese or any bad feelings?
No, I can't say that I could remember any special incidents that makes me think that there was anti-Japanese incidents, only what I read in the paper.
You didn't ever have any problems yourself?
No.
Well, let's go on to the day everything changed, December 7th. Mr. Kawaguchi, you told me that you'd been in the library that day.
Yeah, I was in the library.
You really noticed something.
I was in the library that day, and when I came out, the first thing that hit me was the newspaper. It says Pearl Harbor bombed, and so where in the world is Pearl Harbor? Right? And then when I looked at the headlines very carefully, it says Jap bombers bombed Pearl Harbor. And I had the funniest feeling all of a sudden. I felt like everybody and their uncle was looking at me. So I hurried home, and when I got to Japantown, the place looked as though it was deserted. No one was out in the streets, and some of the stores were still open. And as soon as I got home, my parents said, stay home, we don't want you to be wandering around. And as I looked out the window, I could see extra police cars in the area. And suddenly I began to see, I guess they could have either been detectives or FBI agents because they were in the area. And had a completely different feeling all of a sudden. I suddenly felt insecure. I don't know quite how to describe it, but it was a funny feeling. It was the funniest feeling I ever had, and that was on December 7th, but gradually it wore out as public information began to come out.
Now, you saw some people that looked like agents and police on the street.
Right.
But you actually saw them come to the house.
Yes, they must have come maybe about 4 or 5 days after Pearl Harbor. My father was very active in the Japanese community and belonged to the Japanese Association, which acted like middleman between the city hall and the Japanese community, so that when they had things like in those days called community chess drives, or if there were any Japanese important person who came to San Francisco, the city hall would approach Japanese Association to put on a reception, that kind of a thing for them. But because he was active, his name was probably on the list of those that the FBI's were alerted to pick up. They also had a list of former Japanese Army or Navy people who had since left the service and come to America. And we had a friend who lived only a few blocks away, and he was picked up immediately by the FBI right after Pearl Harbor. And there were some others who also were gone to immigration, I
During
guess.
these 3 or 4 days, were you worried about your father?
Yes, we did. We kind of felt then if his other friends were, I hate to use the word picked up, but taken away by the FBI, it would be a matter of time. And my father was halfway prepared. He had a suitcase packed. And when they came, 2 men came. It was by then no surprise. He had already told my mother and my older sister, who was in charge, what to do about keeping the hotel that my father was running, how to keep it going, how to take care of it financially. And he went prepared, my father did.
Well, tell me, I mean, you had been worried, you'd been expecting it, and so it finally happened. Did it seem fair?
Well, we never stopped to think whether it was fair or unfair, unfortunately. Because his friends went, it's almost like we thought, well, inevitably, Papa will go too.
Let's talk a little bit about the 2 or 3 months between Pearl Harbor and the evacuation. First of all, between December 7th and whenever the evacuation order was issued, did you have a sense that things were going to get worse? When did you feel vulnerable?
I really felt vulnerable was when the Executive Order 9066 came out. But at that time, we kind of felt that our parents would be primarily the target.
Yeah. I'm sorry, let's stop for a second. There's some noise outside. Okay, I was asking you if you felt apprehensive, but let me put the question a different way. What did you feel when the order came out? How did you react?
When the Executive Order 9066 came out, we were astonished, really. At that time, I was doing some volunteer work for the JCL in San Francisco because it was a couple doors from my house. And when the executive order came out and we were trying to interpret what they were trying to say, we kind of felt that it was primarily for our parents who are not citizens. And but then we looked at the word, it says aliens and non-aliens, and we said, non-aliens, I wonder who they could be. And finally, it became quite obvious as to who the non-aliens were. And so it meant that the citizens would also be incarcerated. And we finally got our word a week before May 1st. And to gather our material together. And
but even before that, I mean, did it?
I'm sorry, I
Okay.
do that line.
What?
It meant that citizens.
That's okay. That's okay. Let's just go on. I mean, how did you respond to the fact that you, as a United States citizen, were going to be locked up?
Well, it's really somehow or other. Our parents had always taught us to respect the laws and so forth, and at the same time, the JCL had stated that we'll cooperate with the government any way we can for the war effort, and so consequently, we accepted that fact and says, well, that's what they want us to do. I guess this is our way of proving our loyalty or whatever. And so when we received our notice a week before, we then began to gather all of our property together and so forth. And they told us that the government will protect our property, place it in storage and so forth and so on, which turned out to be just a few words, because we lost just about everything. It was looted and it was gone. But it was on May 1st that we actually moved to Tanforan Assembly Center, which is the racetrack down in San Bruno.
Back up a little bit. I understand how, in terms of the value of respect for authority and how that works in Japanese society, but was there another part of you that said, well, I know I have to do this? Oops. But there's something wrong here? Let's change. I'm asking for a moral judgment. Kawaguchi 6. I guess I wanted to get one more level of your thoughts. I know that you felt you had to cooperate, and then in fact that was expressed that was how you're supposed to help the war effort. But on a moral level, what did you think of the situation?
At first I was angry. I was very angry at first. I says, well, I'm an American citizen, and why should I be going into an internment camp and so forth? But then, of course, the cooler heads were telling us that, well, it's the law right now, and we don't have much choice. And they're stating that it's military necessity, and of course, you can't challenge that. And at the same time, I guess we were kind of naive too, because the military, as long as the city government was operating, or the state government was operating, military law had no effect. And but we didn't know that. And much of this came out later when they had the investigation and so forth. But at that time, most of us were a little bit upset. And but the word came out from our community leaders at that time, the younger. Well, actually, they were the older Niseis. Said, well, there's only one way to go. We've got to cooperate. And at that time, we were told that the Army was ready to move in if we didn't cooperate.
People, other people who've talked to it who certainly weren't forced to go into camps, said that it's very hard to understand the atmosphere of fear, almost hysteria of that time, that people were really afraid. Do you think that would be a sufficient justification for what happened?
No. No, because the thing is, I myself, and my brother and I, we were prepared to volunteer to go into the service, and the word came back that they would not accept any Japanese Americans for the service. And we knew very little about Japan, actually, and at the same time, our parents had told us that this is your country and this is your home. He says, you got to protect your own home and your own country. And there was no question in their minds, which made it easier for my brother and I to later volunteer for the services, because my dad especially liked it here, and he never did go back to Japan, nor did my mother, and at the same time they never spoke about ever going to Japan. They found that this was their home and that they were going to build it.
Were there any voices raised to support the Japanese during that period? Did you have any friends?
We had a couple Caucasian friends who were very kind and tried to assist us in any way they could. And there was one fellow who was more or less our music director, and he worked very closely with us. But he was finally threatened by the FBI that he could no longer visit his Japanese friends and that he must leave San Francisco. And he ended up in Salt Lake City himself.
Well, you've told me that there was a lot of, once the evacuation, that there was a lot of anti-Japanese feeling that Chinese wore buttons saying, I'm not Japanese.
Right.
Tell me about that.
Well, that was one of the first things that when the newspapers began to publish about the evacuation and so forth, the Chinese felt threatened, so they start wearing a button that says, I am a Chinese American. And that kind of hit us in the raw nerve, because we didn't have our friend, or not even the ACLU didn't come to our rescue, except the director of Northern California. The national group did not come.
I don't know if either one of you saw it. There's a photograph that Dorothea Lange took during that period of a Japanese-American store in Oakland, and it has a sign across it saying, I am an American.
Oh yeah, that's a wonton company.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
the Japanese Americans were Americans too, weren't they?
Right.
How did you feel about going in the camps? Did you feel you didn't have any choice?
Right. It's that Japanese shikataganai. It became what the law at that time, and so we just abide by it. My father was already away. He was sent to North Dakota, I think. My mother was not the leader of the family. My sister took that role, and she's the one who did all the registering of the family, getting
Let's
all.
stop for a second. We have okay. Well.
Mark again. I didn't have a pre-roll.
Oh, okay. We should
Okay.
second mark.
Yeah.
Second slate.
Go ahead.
Take
Thank
7.
you.
Well, Mrs. Kawaguchi, tell me, can you remember the actual day you packed up and left for the camp? Tell me a little bit about what you felt and what you went through that day.
Well, we
Wait,
left
okay.
on.
Let the motorcycle. Okay.
Go ahead.
We actually left San Francisco on April 6th. I had 2 married sisters, one living in Japantown. We were living on the outskirts, so we were the first to go. And another sister living in Berkeley. And she could not come over to say goodbye to us because I think they were limited where they could travel to. So my sister in San Francisco and her husband came down to help us bring the hand baggage that we were allowed to carry. And we ordered a taxi, and we all piled in there and went out to Venice Avenue. It was a big Red Cross building there. And there were buses waiting for us over there. And they took us down toward the waterfront where the trains were waiting for us.
Did you have a sense that day that there was the end of a certain way of life, or that everything would be different?
Well, you just felt that something different was going to happen. The fact that we were going to go on a train, we didn't know where we were going to go. My 2 oldest sisters didn't come with us. My father wasn't there. That you just knew there was going to be something different in the future. However, ultimately, we did all end up in the same relocation camps.
Mr. Kawaguchi, can you talk a little bit about the day you were evacuated?
It was on May 1st, 1942, that we were evacuated to Tanforan Assembly Center. And we assembled on Bush and Buchanan Street in early morning, and the buses were there to take us to Tanforan. And we arrived at Tanforan, and we were greeted by some of our friends who were there earlier. And that first day was days of horror, believe me. When we arrived there, the baggage was piled high, and we were told that they will be delivered to our barracks, whatever barracks we will be in. And so we arrived in the barracks where the room was 20 by 20, and it was 5 adults would be in that particular room. And we were more fortunate than some of the other people because the others were in the horse stalls, and
You at least had a room.
and I had a regular barracks that was just constructed, newly constructed.
Before you talk about that, let me ask you, when you were there waiting to be evacuated, did you really understand then what that meant in terms of this was the last chapter of that physical period of your life?
I think most of us felt that we more or less psychologically treated it as an adventure because many of us didn't travel too much in those days, and it seemed like it was just going to be an adventure. And we try to approach it that way, and my father, being an invalid, took most of our attention, especially helping him on the bus and making sure that he was comfortable, and my mother, so that we were too busy trying to take care of each other to really give it some.
So we have to change film.
Mark.
Yeah. Okay. Again, time to think about things, time to figure out what really happened. Sometimes one's view changes, and as you were saying, when you both were going through the process, you really, even if you wanted to think, you didn't have time to think because you were trying to keep your lives together, and it was probably better to be positive because that was a better way to get through it. But now looking back at it, do you have a different thought about it now than you had then?
No, I still have the same feeling of anger that such a thing did happen, but I was never bitter. The one thing that I realize about America is that there are a lot of good people here, and it's just a few that happen to be in power at the time and playing their game, as they were, and it was primarily the political leadership was poor, and they succumbed to the pressures of some of the pressure groups. And of course, it was economic gain by many of the farmers and property owners and so forth. And so they saw an opportunity to take over. And a good example also is in Chinatown, San Francisco. Majority of the better stores were owned by the Japanese. But once the Japanese moved out, the Chinese had literally taken over. And today, I believe there's only one or two Japanese art goods stores in Chinatown. And the other opportunities, of course, the farms were taken over, the businesses were taken over. Some people never recovered. Others were fortunate enough to have friends to take over and had the property maintained until they returned. When I think of what really happened, the destruction of the Japanese community, the destruction of the family relationship, the price that was paid by the Japanese American was very high. And my father, for example, died shortly after he came out of the camp. He was an invalid at the time when he went in, and of course medical care was minimal at best. And if it weren't for the doctors, the Japanese American doctors, who brought their own medicine and their own equipment in order to maintain some sort of medical services, again, it was these kinds of things that really made me angry. They talk in terms of that we were comfortable and so forth, and it was to the contrary. In fact, when I joined the Army, it was just like seventh heaven. The food was good, the accommodations were fine, and so forth. Whereas in camp, it was just the opposite. The food was terrible. The accommodations were almost primitive.
Mrs. Kawaguchi, have you thought more about it? I mean, obviously, it's there, and let me put it this way: when you thought about it more, have you thought about it differently than you thought about it then?
Well, the unfairness always is in my mind of the whole evacuation. But the evacuation also opened up other areas to us. With the bad came some good, and my father encouraged us to leave camp. He didn't in the beginning. He wanted us all to be together, but he encouraged us to leave. And leaving camp and going to other parts of the country opened our eyes to the opportunities for us here. But the fact that we were evacuated, the unfairness is always there. Feeling of unfairness.
Do you think America learned something from that?
Well, I hope so. I do get encouraged sometimes by what I read in the papers, the open letters to the editors, that there are some who still writes very bitter anti-Japanese or anti-Japanese American letters. But every time you read one of those, the following week there'll be another one who writes really encouraging words of understanding and support for what the Japanese Americans have gone through.
Mr. Kawaguchi, let me ask you the same question. Do you think America learned the right thing from that experience?
Let's wait for
Okay, oops, let's cut.
Yep.
Okay. Kawaguchi, take 9. I guess I was just starting to ask you, or you were starting to answer, whether America learned the right lessons from that experience.
I hope so. Somehow or other, I wonder, because especially when the Iran deal came along and the Iraq deal, they were prepared to take anyone of the Middle East and lock them up. And so it
Well,
was...
I imagine you would like the lesson you would like people to learn would be that it should never happen again.
It should never happen again.
Would you say that again?
That it should never happen again.
No, just say it should never happen.
It should never happen again. And the one thing that makes me angry, especially with these hate letters that come out and these anti-Japanese American things that come out, is that I know the price that we paid. I know that we fought during World War II. We fought in Korea. We fought in Vietnam, Grenada, and we've paid the price, and the maximum price. Some of those young men that I remembered who died on the battlefield, they were only 18, 19-year-old kids, and they never had a chance to see what was happening. I doubt if they will ever know that what we had achieved during that period. And when I think about it, when I was serving in Vietnam, it was the same way. I felt that somehow or other we need to educate the young people and let them know the price that we pay for racism, and essentially that's what it was. When you get down to basics, more recently on the television program, someone says, "Why do you call yourselves Japanese Americans?" I said, "Why don't you just call yourselves Americans?" Well, you know, when you look at a person's face and...
Well, let me throw the question around the other way. Why do you think America can't allow people to be different, as we saw in the 30s? The Japanese were locked up because they were different.
Well, I really don't think that they were different, really, because it isn't the way you look or the color. It's what's inside of you and how you feel. And more recently, the more recent immigrants that have come in, they tell us there's no place like the United States. He says, you don't know what freedom is until you live in the other countries. And says, you come to the United States and says, gee, you're really your own person.
Well, would you agree with the statement that some people have made about the 30s, that that the one of the things that happened from the decade and America going to the war was that democracy was strengthened?
Somehow or other, was strengthened for who? And that's essentially the question that I come up with, because many times when I meet some new Caucasian friends, their immediate reaction is, where are you from? And I says, well, I'm from San Francisco. He says, no, where are you really from? I said, well, I'm really from Tacoma, Washington. That's where I was born. Oh, no wonder you speak English well. You know, and at one time I just responded, so do you. So what do you do? I mean, essentially this is where the problem is. They look at your face and says, gee, he must be from China or Vietnam or Japan or someplace.
Well, I think racism is a good way to describe it. Do you think